The first time listening to Howl by Allen Ginsberg is an experience. Love it or hate it, Ginsberg's poetry is something that's difficult to ignore. Howl was part of a kind of sea change in American literary expression. There's an energy in the writing, a wild naivety. Hearing Ginsberg perform is like listening in on the secrets that America does not want told, shouted from a street corner by one of its many beleaguered children. Howl begins. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. What follows is a sort of drugged-out sermon that is both scathing and celebratory. It sounds like an attack, but also a weird, sentimental requiem. Ginsberg paints America as a place of brutality and great beauty, of fierce progress and aching loneliness, a sort of failed utopian project. The imagery pours out in erratic streams as he pulls us through the chaotic streets of New York, on drug runs from Mexico to lonely alcoholic deaths in Denver, Colorado. It's a soup of people, places, music, nightmares and meditations. Ginsberg was following the lead of Jack Kerouac, the godfather of what would become known as the Beat Generation. He was also a progeny of writers like Walt Whitman and William Blake, visionaries who skated the borders between this world and the realms of the spirit. Ginsberg and writers like him were not really accepted by the literary establishment at first. Major publications and critics often saw them as rebellious but unserious, viewing their unconventional styles and provocative subject matter as lacking in substance or polish. Truman Capote famously dismissed beat writing with the quip, "That's not writing, it's typing." He was skeptical of the spontaneity the beats valued, especially Kerouac's On the Road, but Howl was a notable breakthrough, possibly because there really was nothing quite like it at the time. While part one of Howl consists of a kind of circus-like retelling of the antics of a disaffected generation, part two takes a turn into much darker territory. A question is posed. What sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination? Ginsberg gives pause for a moment, looking up from the chaotic, ranting energy of his contemporaries and friends' lives to ask, why all this madness and unfettered debauchery? What is pushing people to the frayed edges of sanity? Why are this generation consumed in a whirlwind of desperation, dreaming, and instability? His answer, Moloch, a name that even on first hearing it spoken without any knowledge of its meaning or where it came from, carries a strange foreboding. It sounds ancient, from some other world. What is this thing? This Moloch the loveless, this Moloch the heavy judger of men. A curse, a place, a monster. The name Moloch itself carries a rich and horrifying history. In ancient Canaanite and Israelite culture, Moloch was a god associated with child sacrifice. In the Bible, the Israelites are warned against passing their children through the fire to Moloch. The image of Moloch is one of cruelty and inhumanity, a god that demands the most precious and innocent of sacrifices, the lives of children, in exchange for power, fertility, or favour. It represents a fundamental moral corruption where human life becomes just another form of currency, another resource to be expended for gain. In Howl, Ginsberg's invocation of Moloch isn't just a clever metaphor, it's a deeply rooted symbolic connection to the idea that society demands human sacrifice. The children offered up to Moloch in ancient times are mirrored in modern society's willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable, whether that's the young, the poor, or the marginalised. For the sake of maintaining power structures, MOLOCH, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, Ginsberg writes, conjuring the image of faceless, inhuman bureaucracies watching over us, blind to the pain and suffering they cause. These blind windows are like the eyes of the devouring God staring out from the cold skyscrapers and government buildings, indifferent to the humanity they overlook. The people who live and work inside these buildings are themselves sacrifices, trapped in the relentless drive of capitalism and industrialization. MOLOCH is the ultimate betrayal of human potential, turning human beings into disposable units, their creativity and individuality crushed under the weight of a system that demands everything from them and gives little back. In Ginsberg's reality, we've constructed this monstrous entity out of our ambitions, our systems, our need for order and progress, but in doing so, we've created something that consumes us. MOLOCH, whose mind is pure machinery. MOLOCH, whose blood is running money. MOLOCH, whose breast is a cannibal dynamo. There's a personal grief in this critique that feels familiar to anyone who's ever felt crushed by the weight of expectation, by the need to fit into a world that doesn't care about who you are, just what you can contribute. A person's worth is measured by their ability to serve the beast. Otherwise, they're a burden. It's one of the most profound problems of our age. This force is merciless, an engine that keeps running whether or not it destroys the people inside it. How many of us feel like we are living in service of some larger unseen entity? We're told that the sacrifices are necessary, that we need to work harder, be more productive, stay plugged in, but to what end? What are we actually feeding? The potential for great destruction hides under the guise of building something, but what is that something and what are its demands on us, its creators? MOLOCH, this deity of sacrifice, isn't some distant myth. It's right here, embedded in the structures we've surrounded ourselves with. Every job that drains the life out of you, every system that prioritizes profit over people, every cultural norm that demands you suppress your true self just to be accepted. That's MOLOCH. The more we give, the more it demands. We feel it in the quiet moments, the late nights, when you're left questioning if any of this is worth it. We pay our way, we contribute. If we fall behind, letters will arrive. Then men will show up at our doors to enforce the appetites of this invisible entity. We listen to the political class, give them endless chances to change things. They make promises, give performative speeches about freedom and democracy. But then we look out at the world and we see bombs incinerating innocent people, children suffocating in mines, the planet burning. Ginsberg's refusal to be silent, his rage against this destructive force, is an act of defiance, a reminder that even in the face of something as immense as MOLOCH, we can try to resist, and we should. Howl states, "This is what we've built, this is the monster we serve, and this is what it costs." Raised in New Jersey, Ginsberg grew up with Jewish traditions and values. His relationship with his Jewishness was complex. While he didn't adhere strictly to religious practices, he was deeply connected to his cultural identity, history, and the legacy of suffering and resilience it represented. To fully understand Ginsberg's conception of MOLOCH, it's helpful to consider the Jewish myth of the Golem, a creature from Kabbalistic folklore. The golem, typically made from clay and brought to life through mystical rituals, was often created to serve and protect its community in times of need. This creature appears in the 16th century story The Golem of Prague, in which a rabbi brings the golem into existence as a force that would stand against the persecutions facing the Jewish community at the time. The golem is crafted from clay near a riverbank, which is fused with water and earth. The clay is then brought into the formation of a man by a swarm of fire, solidifying the great creature. Then, it is finally animated with the reciting of Genesis, the story of Adam breathing air into his nostrils, giving him the gift of life. However, the golem would ultimately become uncontrollable, wreaking havoc on the very people it was meant to protect. Left to its own devices, it rampages through the Jewish ghettos, destroying many of the very establishments and homes it had been tasked with protecting. In the end, the golem has to be subdued or destroyed by its creators to prevent it from bringing on total ruin. Ginsberg's MOLOCH could be seen as a kind of modern golem, a creation intended to serve humanity that instead brings suffering and devastation. In the same way that the golem is a manifestation of human ingenuity twisted into something dangerous, our modern golems are the industrial machines, financial institutions, and war engines that were constructed to advance civilization, but have become monstrous, devouring resources, and more tragically, human lives. In Howl, Ginsberg echoes an age-old warning: beware of the gods you make, for they may demand a sacrifice greater than you are willing to pay. One of the most direct ways this manifests is through the war machine. The 1950s, when Ginsberg wrote Howl, were marked by the lingering shadow of World War II and the burgeoning Cold War. The Manhattan Project had already happened, which saw the creation of the world's most destructive of all weapons, the atom bomb. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the terrible fruits of this labour. Men had discovered the ultimate world ender, as if they were harnessing the power of a man-made, wrathful God. The arms race and the military-industrial complex saw Ginsberg's MOLOCH in full action. Systems that demand human lives as sacrifices, not for any tangible gain, but to maintain the illusion of power, safety, and dominance. War is great profit, and this profit demands more war. Annihilation feeds MOLOCH, and its hunger is a bottomless pit. MOLOCH, whose factories dream and croak in the fog, Ginsberg writes, evoking the image of military factories producing weapons of war while shrouded in secrecy and confusion. The people who work in these factories are part of the machine, contributing to a system that they may not fully understand but are nonetheless bound to. The dream of these factories is one of endless production, of progress defined not by human flourishing, but by the accumulation of destructive power. War is one of the most ancient and persistent ways that societies sacrifice their young. Just as the Israelites once sacrificed their children to Moloch, today's wars, whether they're fought for resources, ideology, or control, are justified by the same cold logic that underpins Moloch's hunger. Human lives are offered up in exchange for the preservation of power, the continuation of the state, the maintenance of the status quo. The war machine is Moloch's most devastating face, one that consumes not just soldiers, but entire societies. Our endless participation corrodes us from the inside, decade after decade. Moloch, whose name is the mind, Ginsberg screams. This isn't just a war machine, it's the mindset that drives it, the mindset that allows human beings to be dehumanized, their lives reduced to statistics, collateral damage, their deaths explained away as the cost of doing business. Ginsberg is howling against this cold, intellectualized view of the world, where everything can be justified if it serves some manufactured goal, even if that goal is built on the bodies of the dead. Moloch, whose fingers are 10 armies, explicitly connects this force with militarism, portraying the American war machine as a many-armed beast, vast and grasping. The empire is casting its tentacles across oceans through endless meddling in foreign affairs, spying on perceived enemies. Assassinations, propaganda, mind control, genocide, all in the name of Moloch. When atrocities are committed, they are a just cause. Resistance is barbaric. Resistance is terrorism. This is the great mass hypnosis of the God who devours. It has convinced its captives of its exceptionalism. Its crimes are not crimes. They are always defense, violence committed in the name of preserving civilization. This machinery operates with brutal mechanical efficiency. Moloch's mind as pure machinery, its blood running money, a soulless, profit-driven system that treats humans as fuel. There's a kind of helplessness in Ginsberg's depiction of individuals caught in Moloch's grasp. Moloch, the incomprehensible prison, he writes, conjuring the image of a society that not only traps its people but makes it impossible for them to understand the forces that control them. The people Ginsberg describes are imprisoned by the very systems they helped create, systems that now dominate every aspect of their lives. And these systems are passed from one generation to the next. Ginsberg is not immune. He admits, Moloch, who entered my soul early. He isn't speaking as a detached observer, he's speaking from within the belly of the beast. He's felt the destruction that Moloch brings, both to himself and to the people he loves. And when the soul of the individual is destroyed, this destruction radiates outward into the world. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone, he writes, describing a world where the very idea of love has been corrupted. Instead of love being about connection, intimacy, and human warmth, it has been replaced by an endless pursuit of material wealth. Individualism has been corroded into a toxic form. Mantras are repeated. It's a dog-eat-dog world, or every man for himself. The illusion that freedom is in the hands of those who can play the game the best. Shunning community, stepping over the weak to capture the dangled carrot of success. But what is this success that pits us against our fellow human? Ginsberg's Moloch observes its minions as they tear each other to pieces. It atomizes us into units of self-interest and suspicion, rather than part of a collective whole. The destruction Moloch causes isn't just physical, it's spiritual. Moloch, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen, he writes, referencing again the atom bomb, one of the ultimate symbols of Moloch's destructive power. This bomb represents not just the capacity for physical annihilation, but the triumph of Moloch's cold, mechanical logic over the human spirit. It is sexless, a cloud of sulfur and ash, a fate that is disembodied. Ginsberg's diagnosis of the ills within America falls down at one major hurdle, possibly the most inhumane and oppressive aspects of this American Moloch of his times, the ongoing crime and shameful practice of racial segregation and persecution of his fellow Black Americans, the absence of critique in Howl for the Jim Crow laws and brutalization of non-white Americans is very revealing if we ask how something so obviously barbaric would be missed by Ginsberg's pen. Although Howl captures the struggle of marginalized individuals, those battling mental illness, poverty, drug addiction, and a general sense of alienation, the poem primarily focuses on issues that were central to Ginsberg and his circle, namely the struggles of white, bohemian subcultures. How could this omission exist in a work that seems so intent on calling America out on its inhumanities? Was it a lack of insight on Ginsberg's part, or did he not see it as all that troubling? One explanation for this blind spot could point to the effectiveness of the very Moloch that Ginsberg is railing against. It has worked on him also, to the point where he does not recognize his own privileges as a white American. He is protected from this greater persecution by the nature of his skin color. Segregation and violence against black Americans has been normalized within this Moloch. Ginsberg speaks of personal liberation and the exploration of consciousness, while great numbers of his fellow Americans are simply fighting for the right to live and be seen as full human beings. Ginsberg saw himself as critiquing systems that oppressed everyone in some way, such as capitalism and institutionalized mental health practices. The broader focus on existential despair may have led him to sideline specific social issues like segregation. But this is an easy position to take when you are not under the boot of a system that punishes you for an immutable characteristic. Even though Ginsberg and his contemporaries were suffering within this Moloch, they were also part of the dominant population. It's a perfect example of how insidious the systems we build can be. They wrap themselves around us, offering endless distractions, so we often fail to see the rot that is taking place right under our noses. What could be the antidote to this Moloch, if any? Sadly, it feels like there is no reversing what we have built in any real or concrete fashion, other than complete destruction. This is a grim and deeply pessimistic thought to have, but a rebirth of the world, of the Western world, and all its tentacles would call for a dismantling. But can we live in this Moloch and maintain some connection to the soul? In some small way, can we recognize the vast suffering that is a symptom of this monster and not turn away? In times where it is no longer a hidden suffering, but one we can see out in the open. If we have not lost our humanity, surely there is a duty to resist this God who devours, to speak out against its appetites. Ginsberg's Howl against Moloch is a call to reclaim ourselves from the forces that seek to destroy us. He's not offering easy answers or solution. He's simply acknowledging the pain, the destruction, and the overwhelming power of the systems that control us. But in that acknowledgement, there is defiance. By naming Moloch, by calling out the forces that oppress us, we are not totally powerless. We may be trapped in Moloch's prison, but we still have the capacity to howl, to resist, to refuse to be consumed completely. Moloch, whose buildings are judgment, he writes. And it's true. Moloch is a force of judgment, a system that decides who is worthy and who is not. But Ginsberg is pushing back, reminding us that our worth is not determined by how well we serve this machine. Our worth is intrinsic, tied to our individuality, our creativity, our music, our art, our capacity for love and connection, our community with others, our solidarity with those suffering the most. In its footnote, Ginsberg signs off with the lines, "Holy forgiveness, mercy, charity, faith, holy the supernatural, extra brilliant, intelligent kindness of the soul."
Moloch, Moloch, nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of men, Moloch the stunned government, Moloch in whom I sit lonely,